Hello, dear friends. Today we will talk about one of the most mysterious and famous states of the ancient world, Sparta. Even more than 2,000 years later, the name of the Spartans still inspires respect and admiration. They were considered unmatched warriors, capable of enduring incredible hardships. They raised their children under harsh conditions, lived according to strict laws, and placed the interests of the state above their own personal desires. But was life in Sparta really as heroic as it is portrayed in movies? Why did the Spartans become a symbol of courage? How did they manage to create one of the most powerful armies of the ancient world? And what ultimately led their mighty state to decline? Today, we will take a detailed look at the history of Sparta, from its rise to its fall, and discover how people lived in this extraordinary society. Enjoy the video, The Birth of Sparta, The Road to Greatness. To understand why Sparta became the most famous military state of the ancient world, we must travel back nearly 3,000 years and discover how its story began. After the collapse of the powerful Mycenaean civilization, Greece entered a period of instability. Many cities were destroyed, trade networks collapsed, and the population declined significantly. Historians refer to this era as the Greek Dark Ages. However, it was during this difficult time that new Greek states began to emerge. Among the peoples who migrated south into the Balkan Peninsula were the Dorians. These were warlike tribes that gradually occupied vast territories of the Peloponnese. Among the lands they settled was the region of Laconia. The Eurotas River flowed through this area, while the mountain ranges of Taygetus and Parnon rose on either side. This region possessed several important advantages. The mountains provided natural protection from enemies. The fertile valley supplied the inhabitants with abundant harvests. The river provided water for agriculture. It was here that several small Dorian settlements were established. Over time, they united and formed a new city-state, Sparta. Unlike many other Greek polis, Sparta did not seek to impress others with luxury. No grand palaces were built here. No magnificent monuments were erected. The streets were not adorned with expensive sculptures. The greatest wealth of the state was believed to be its people and their ability to defend their land. Ancient Greek travelers were often surprised by Sparta's appearance. Compared to wealthy Athens, the city seemed rather modest. Yet behind this outward simplicity lay immense strength. The first centuries of Sparta's existence were marked by constant warfare. The state sought to expand its territory and strengthen its position among neighboring powers. Its most important objective became Messenia, a wealthy region located west of Laconia. Messenia possessed fertile lands that could provide Sparta with food for generations to come. However, the people of Messenia had no intention of submitting willingly to their new neighbors. Thus began the First Messenian War. It lasted for approximately 20 years. Both sides suffered heavy losses. Battles alternated with lengthy sieges. At times, it seemed that no victor would ever emerge. But gradually, Spartan military organization began to produce results. Eventually, Messenia was conquered. For Sparta, this was an enormous success. The territory of the state expanded significantly. New agricultural lands became available. However, the story did not end there. The conquered people refused to accept their fate. Several decades later, a new uprising erupted. The Second Messenian War began. Proved even more difficult than the first. The Messenians fought desperately for their freedom. For many years, the struggle continued with varying success. But once again, victory belonged to Sparta. After the war, most of the population of Messenia was transformed into Helots. But who were the Helots? They were dependent agricultural laborers. They were not slaves in the traditional sense of the word, but neither could they be considered free people. The Helots were bound to the land and were required to surrender a significant portion of their harvest to their masters. It was their labor that ensured the prosperity of Spartan citizens. Gradually, the number of helots became enormous. According to some estimates, several dependent laborers existed for every Spartan citizen. This situation created a serious problem. The Spartans lived in constant fear of rebellion. They understood that if the helots united, they could pose a deadly threat to the state. As a result, the authorities were forced to maintain the army in a permanent state of readiness. In fact, the entire Spartan system began to revolve around a single objective: maintaining control over the conquered population. Every man was expected to be a warrior. Every citizen was required to know how to fight. Every young boy had to undergo a harsh education. Over time, these requirements became the foundation of Spartan society. While other Greek cities developed trade and craftsmanship, Sparta invested in military power. Athens built ships. Corinth expanded its trade networks. Miletus became a center of learning and science. Sparta, meanwhile, was transforming into a vast military camp. A unique way of life gradually emerged here. The state demanded discipline from its citizens. Personal interests became secondary. Service to the common good became the highest virtue. It was during this period that the traditions which would later make the Spartans famous throughout the world began to take shape. Harsh upbringing of children, unquestioning obedience to the law, willingness to sacrifice oneself for the state, contempt for luxury, the pursuit of physical excellence. All of this gradually transformed Sparta into a unique state unlike any other in ancient Greece. But for such a system to function, special laws and strict rules were required. According to ancient tradition, it was at this moment that a man appeared on the stage of history whose name would forever be associated with Sparta. Lycurgus and the laws that changed Sparta. When we talk about Sparta, it is impossible to ignore the man whom many consider the creator of this unique state. His name is known to anyone interested in the history of ancient Greece. This was Lycurgus, the legendary lawgiver, reformer, and perhaps the most influential figure in Spartan history. But here an interesting question arises. Did Lycurgus actually exist? Historians still cannot give a definitive answer. Some ancient authors considered him a real historical figure. Others believed he was a composite character representing several rulers and reformers. However, whether Lycurgus was a real person or a legend, the creation of the Sparta we know today is closely associated with his name. According to ancient traditions, Lycurgus traveled extensively in his youth. He visited different lands, studied the laws of other peoples, and examined various systems of government. After traveling to Crete, Asia Minor, and other regions of the Mediterranean, he supposedly concluded that the main causes of weakness in many states were internal conflicts, the struggle for wealth, and people's tendency to place their own interests above those of society. Upon returning to Sparta, Lycurgus decided to change the existing order. According to legend, before beginning his reforms, he traveled to the famous temple of Apollo at Delphi. There stood one of the most renowned oracles of the ancient world. The oracle supposedly endorsed Lycurgus's plans and predicted that his laws would bring Sparta greatness and glory. After that, reforms began that would transform the life of the state for many centuries. The primary goal of these reforms was to create a strong and united society. Lycurgus understood that wealth and poverty could divide citizens and create internal conflict. Therefore, he attempted to reduce economic inequality. According to tradition, all land was divided among citizens into roughly equal plots. Each family received enough land to provide the food necessary for its survival. This system helped prevent some individuals from becoming excessively wealthy at the expense of others. Of course, over time this equality disappeared, but the idea itself had a profound impact on Spartan society. Even more unusual were the measures taken against luxury. Lycurgus believed that the love of wealth weakened a person's character. As a result, Sparta sought to limit the accumulation of precious possessions and luxury goods. According to ancient accounts, even money was deliberately made inconvenient. Instead of gold and silver coins, heavy iron bars were supposedly used as currency. They were so large and cumbersome that they were difficult to store and transport. Such a system made large-scale trade nearly impossible and discouraged the accumulation of vast fortunes. Naturally, modern historians question some of the details of these stories, but one fact remains clear. Spartan society genuinely looked down upon luxury. While wealthy Athenians decorated their homes with works of art and hosted lavish banquets, Spartans took pride in their simplicity. Lycurgus devoted special attention to the education of citizens. He was convinced that the fate of the state depended upon the character of its people. For that reason, the upbringing of children became the responsibility of the state rather than the family. A Spartan was expected to understand from an early age that his life belonged not only to himself but also to his polis. It was here that the foundations of the famous Agoge system emerged, which we will discuss in greater detail later. No less important were the changes to Sparta's political structure. Interestingly, the state was ruled by two kings simultaneously. Such a system seems unusual even today. One ruler could lead a military campaign while the other remained at home to oversee domestic affairs. In addition, having two kings reduced the risk of a single individual accumulating too much power. Yet even the kings did not possess absolute authority. There was also a council of elders known as the Gerousia. It consisted of the most respected citizens over 60 years of age. The Gerousia debated the most important matters of state, proposed laws, and served as the highest court. There was also a popular assembly. All full male citizens were allowed to participate. They voted on decisions, although their influence was considerably smaller than that of citizens in democratic Athens. Another important institution was the Board of Ephors. Each year, 5 ephors were elected to oversee the actions of the kings and ensure that the laws were obeyed. In practice, the ephors could even hold a king accountable. For the ancient world, this was highly unusual. Thus, Sparta developed a complex system of government in which power was distributed among several institutions. This helped preserve stability for many generations. But the most important result of the reforms was the creation of a unique worldview. Spartans were taught that the interests of the state stood above the interests of any individual. Service to society was considered the highest virtue. Courage, discipline, and loyalty to the law were valued far more than wealth or personal glory. That is why Sparta gradually became a state of warriors. The most respected citizens were not the richest, but the most worthy. Not those who possessed treasures, but those who demonstrated bravery and self-control. Over time, the Spartan way of life became known throughout Greece. Some admired it. Others considered it excessively harsh. But no one could deny one fact. The laws of Lycurgus created a society that remained one of the strongest and most stable in the ancient world for several centuries. Yet Sparta's true strength did not lie in its laws alone. The state's greatest weapon was its people. People who, from early childhood, were prepared for hardship, discipline, and war. The Agoge, the education system that created warriors. If the laws of Lycurgus formed the foundation of Sparta, then the educational system known as the Agoge became the primary instrument for preserving the state. It was through the Agoge that Sparta was able to maintain its military power for generations. The Spartans did not rely on chance or natural talent. The state sought to shape every boy into a disciplined, resilient, and loyal warrior. Unlike most Greek cities where children were raised by their families, Sparta gradually transferred this responsibility to the state. The life of a future Spartan began with a harsh test. According to ancient sources, newborn infants were presented to a council of elders. The elders examined the child and assessed its health and physical condition. The Spartans believed that only strong and healthy children could become worthy defenders of the state. Today, many accounts by ancient authors regarding the fate of weak infants remain a subject of debate among historians. Some believe these stories were exaggerated in order to emphasize Sparta's harshness. However, there is no doubt that great importance was placed on the physical health of children. Until the age of 7, boys lived with their families and were raised by their parents. But at the age of 7, their lives changed dramatically. The child was taken from home and placed into groups of peers. From that moment, the agoge, the state educational system, began. For many boys, this was their first serious challenge. They left behind the familiar comfort of home, separated from their families, and began living among other children under the constant supervision of instructors. The primary goal of the agoge was not teaching reading or writing. The Spartans were primarily concerned with shaping character. Boys were taught to endure pain. They were taught to overcome fear. They were taught to obey orders. They were taught to place the interests of the group above their personal desires. Every day was filled with physical exercise. Young Spartans ran long distances. They practiced wrestling. They threw spears. They trained with weapons. They developed strength, agility, and endurance. But physical training was only one part of the system. Discipline was considered equally important. The boys lived under conditions of constant strictness. They were expected to obey their elders without question. Any display of laziness, cowardice, or disobedience was punished. The Spartans believed that a true warrior must maintain self-control even in the most difficult circumstances. To develop endurance, students were intentionally kept under harsh conditions. They were given minimal clothing. They often went barefoot. They slept on beds made from reeds that they gathered with their own hands. Even food was limited. The rations were sufficient to maintain strength, but not enough to satisfy hunger. It was believed that constant hunger made a person tougher and more resourceful. There is an interesting story often repeated by ancient authors. Boys were encouraged to obtain additional food on their own. They were allowed to steal food if they could do so without being noticed. However, if they were caught, they were punished not for the theft itself, but for failing to conceal their actions. In this way, the Spartans sought to develop resourcefulness and caution in their children. Competition among students was also highly valued. Young men constantly sought to prove their superiority in strength, agility, and courage. Victory earned the respect of both peers and instructors. At the same time, boys were taught to work as a team. They were expected to understand that the success of an individual meant little without the success of the entire group. Special attention was devoted to the ability to endure pain. To modern observers, many Spartan methods may seem excessively harsh. However, the Spartans themselves considered such trials necessary. During military campaigns, a soldier would face hunger, cold, wounds, and mortal danger. Therefore, future warriors were prepared for these hardships in advance. Alongside physical training, there was also intellectual education. Contrary to popular belief, Spartans were not completely uneducated. They learned to read and write. They studied the basics of music and poetry. They listened to stories about the heroes of the past. However, the amount of academic instruction was far less extensive than in Athens. Sparta believed that the primary goal of education was character formation rather than the development of eloquence or philosophical thought. A special emphasis was placed on the art of concise speech. Spartans were taught to speak little but say much. An answer was expected to be brief and meaningful. This is why the word laconic comes from Laconia, the region where Sparta was located. Many stories survive about Spartan brevity. On one occasion, enemies sent the following message: "If we invade Laconia, we will destroy Sparta." The Spartan reply consisted of a single word: "If." Stories like this spread throughout Greece and helped create the image of a people who preferred action over lengthy discussion. As boys grew older, the demands placed upon them became increasingly strict. At the age of 12, living conditions became even harsher. At 18, young men underwent new tests and began advanced military training. They learned to operate as part of military units, studied battlefield tactics, and prepared for service in the army. By around the age of 20, a young man was considered a fully trained warrior. Even then, however, his education was not complete. A Spartan continued to refine his skills throughout his life. Military service remained his primary duty. Full citizenship rights were typically granted only at the age of 30. Only then could a man fully participate in the political life of the state. Thus, the education of a Spartan lasted for more than 20 years. Virtually all of his youth was spent under state supervision. There was a single goal: to create the ideal defender of Sparta. A man who feared no hardship, who did not retreat from danger, who obeyed the laws, who remained loyal to his comrades, and who was prepared to sacrifice his life for his city. These were the men who later formed the famous Spartan army that inspired fear among enemies throughout Greece. But while many people know about the upbringing of Spartan boys, far fewer are aware of the role played by women in Spartan society. Yet, the position of Spartan women differed greatly from that of women in other Greek states. Spartan women, the freest women in ancient Greece. When people talk about Sparta, they usually think of warriors, battles, and the harsh upbringing of boys. However, there is another aspect of Spartan society that surprised even the ancient Greeks themselves. It concerns the women. In many states of ancient Greece, the position of women was highly restricted. This was especially true in Athens. There, most women spent much of their lives at home, rarely participated in public affairs, and had virtually no political influence. But in Sparta, the situation was entirely different. Spartan women enjoyed a degree of freedom that was remarkable for their time. To understand why, we must remember the defining characteristic of Sparta. It was a state of warriors. Most men spent much of their lives in military service, training, or campaigning. Someone had to manage the household, oversee property, and maintain order within the family. That responsibility fell to women. As a result, the state had a strong interest in ensuring that women were strong, independent, and capable. Unlike most Greek girls, Spartan girls received physical training. From an early age, they practiced running, wrestling, discus throwing, and javelin throwing. They participated in athletic competitions and various physical exercises. To the inhabitants of other Greek cities, this seemed highly unusual. Some even criticized the Spartans for such methods of upbringing. The Spartans, however, believed that strong women would give birth to strong children, and strong children were essential for a state of warriors. For this reason, the physical development of girls was considered an important matter of public interest. In addition to athletics, girls were taught how to manage a household. They were expected to supervise servants and helots, oversee food supplies, and protect family property. When men were away, women became the effective managers of family estates. Over time, this gave Spartan women considerable influence in the economic life of the state. This became especially noticeable during the later periods of Spartan history. Many women owned large tracts of land. Some families passed property down to their daughters through inheritance. As a result, a significant portion of Sparta's wealth eventually came to be concentrated in the hands of women. For the ancient world, this was a highly unusual development. Another distinctive feature of Spartan society was its attitude toward marriage. The Spartans viewed the family primarily as the foundation of the state. Marriage was considered an important duty of every citizen. A man was expected to establish a family and raise future defenders of Sparta. The state also paid close attention to the health of married couples. It was believed that strong parents would produce strong children. Therefore, the physical fitness of both men and women was regarded as a matter of state importance. Among the Spartans, there were numerous traditions and customs associated with marriage. Some of them may seem unusual or even strange today, yet all were intended to strengthen families and increase the number of healthy citizens. Spartan women became particularly famous for their character. Ancient authors frequently emphasized their courage, determination, and independence. Many stories and legends about them were passed down through generations. The most famous is the story of a mother sending her son off to war. Before his departure, she handed him his shield and said, "Come back with it or on it." The meaning of these words was perfectly clear. A warrior was expected either to return victorious with his shield or to die in battle and be carried home upon it. He was never to flee the battlefield. Losing one's shield was considered a disgrace. A sword could be dropped accidentally. A spear could break. But the shield protected not only the warrior himself, it protected the entire formation. By throwing away his shield, a soldier endangered his comrades. For this reason, cowardice was regarded as one of the gravest offenses. Stories such as these reveal how deeply military values permeated Spartan society. Women shared the same ideals of courage and devotion to the state as men. They raised future warriors and instilled in their children a sense of duty to their homeland from an early age. Greek philosophers and historians viewed this situation in different ways. Some admired Spartan women. Others considered them excessively independent. For example, some Athenians were astonished by how freely Spartan women expressed their opinions. To them, such behavior seemed highly unusual. But in Sparta itself, it was considered perfectly normal. A woman was expected to be a worthy companion to a warrior and the mother of future defenders of the state. At the same time, it is important to understand that the freedom of Spartan women still had its limits. They did not participate in the popular assembly. They did not hold public office. They did not command armies. Political power remained in the hands of men. Nevertheless, compared to most women of the ancient world, their position was far more privileged. They enjoyed greater independence, better education, and broader property rights. For this reason, historians often describe Spartan women as the freest women in ancient Greece. Yet no matter how important the role of women was, the army remained the ultimate symbol of Sparta. It was through its warriors that the state became famous far beyond the borders of Greece. For many generations, the Spartan army was considered the most powerful land force of the ancient world. The Spartan army, the force feared throughout Greece. For centuries, the name Sparta was synonymous with military power. When the inhabitants of Greek cities heard that a Spartan army was approaching, many understood that they were about to face one of the most highly trained and disciplined forces of their time. But what made this army so formidable? Why was a relatively small state able to earn a reputation as an almost unbeatable military power? To answer these questions, we must understand the fundamental principle of Spartan life. In Sparta, the army was not a separate part of society. The army and society were one and the same. Virtually every full citizen was a professional warrior. In other Greek states, people spent most of their time engaged in trade, craftsmanship, or agriculture, taking up arms only when war broke out. In Sparta, everything was different. From early childhood, a man was prepared for military service. Years of training, strict discipline, and constant drills transformed him into a soldier long before he ever faced his first real battle. As a result, the Spartan army possessed a tremendous advantage over most of its enemies. When war began, the Spartans did not need to rush to train recruits. They were already prepared for combat. The backbone of the army consisted of hoplites, heavily armed infantrymen. These warriors formed the elite of Greek armies. Equipping a hoplite was expensive, which meant that not every Greek could afford such equipment. The Spartans, however, considered military service the central purpose of life and devoted special attention to their arms and armor. Their primary weapon was a long spear. It usually measured between 2 and 3 meters in length. The spear allowed warriors to strike enemies from a distance and remained the main weapon during formation combat. If a spear broke, the warrior would draw a short sword. This weapon was designed for close combat, when opponents fought at arm's length. Another essential piece of equipment was the large round shield. For a Spartan, the shield held special significance. It protected not only its owner, but also the comrade standing beside him. That is why losing one's shield was considered a disgrace. The Spartans used to say, "A warrior carries his helmet and armor for himself, but his shield for the entire formation." In addition, warriors wore bronze helmets, breastplates, and leg armor. Such equipment provided excellent protection, although it was quite heavy. Yet years of training allowed Spartans to move confidently even in full armor. The true strength of the Spartan army did not lie in its equipment. The real secret of its success was discipline. On the battlefield, Spartans operated as a single machine. Every man knew his place. Every man understood his duties. Every man trusted his comrades. This unity was most clearly demonstrated in the famous battle formation known as the phalanx. The phalanx was a dense formation consisting of several ranks of warriors. The hoplites stood shoulder to shoulder. Their shields overlapped. Their spears pointed forward. To an observer, this wall of men and bronze appeared almost impossible to break. For the phalanx to function effectively, perfect coordination was required. If one man faltered, the formation could be disrupted. If someone retreated, a dangerous gap could appear. For this reason, the Spartans devoted enormous attention to collective action. They understood that the strength of an army depended not on the heroism of individual warriors, but on the coordinated efforts of the entire unit. It was this principle that often allowed Spartan phalanxes to defeat larger enemy forces. Military training occupied a special place in Spartan life. Even during peacetime, the army trained constantly. There were formation drills, long marches, competitions, tactical exercises. The Spartans believed that hard sweat in training prevented unnecessary bloodshed on the battlefield. Military discipline extended into everyday life as well. Adult men often dined together in special military communities known as syssitia. These were communal meals. Participants ate together, discussed public affairs, and strengthened bonds of friendship and loyalty. In this way, a sense of unity was created, one that later helped maintain discipline during battle. Interestingly, the Spartans focused not only on physical preparation but also on psychological resilience. They sought to raise men who would not panic under pressure. Fear was considered a natural emotion. However, a true warrior was expected to control it. Many ancient authors remarked upon the calmness of Spartans before battle. One famous story tells how, before a battle, Spartan warriors calmly combed their hair. To their enemies, this behavior seemed strange. But for the Spartans, it was a demonstration of confidence and self-control. They were showing that they did not fear the coming fight. Another distinctive feature of the army was its command structure. Spartan generals enjoyed great respect. However, even the most famous commanders were required to obey the laws of the state. This helped prevent excessive concentrations of power in the hands of a single individual. Thanks to its organization, Sparta gradually became the military leader of the Peloponnese. Many cities entered into alliances with it. Others preferred not to provoke such a dangerous opponent. The reputation of the Spartan army grew with each passing decade. But soon the Greek world would face a threat greater than any it had encountered before. To the east, the vast Persian Empire was expanding rapidly. Its rulers controlled enormous territories and commanded immense armies. When the Persians decided to conquer Greece, the fate of the entire Greek world was placed in jeopardy. It was then that the Spartans would face the greatest test in their history and perform a feat that would forever make them a legend. The Persian threat, Greece's greatest test. By the beginning of the 5th century BC, Sparta was already considered one of the most powerful states in Greece. Its army inspired respect among allies and fear among enemies. Yet a threat soon appeared on the horizon that made all previous wars seem like minor conflicts by comparison. That threat was the Persian Empire. At the time, Persia was the largest state in the known world. Its territories stretched from the shores of the Mediterranean Sea to the distant lands of Central Asia. Dozens of peoples, speaking different languages and living across vast regions, lived under the rule of the Persian kings. At the head of this mighty empire stood King Darius I. He dreamed of expanding the borders of his empire and bringing the Greek cities along the western coast of Asia Minor under his control. Initially, many Greek city-states were already subject to Persian rule. However, in 499 BC, the Ionian Revolt broke out. The Greek cities of Asia Minor rose up against Persian domination. Athens and several other Greek states came to the aid of the rebels. Although the uprising was ultimately crushed, Darius never forgot the Greek intervention. He decided to punish Athens and, at the same time, conquer all of Greece. Thus began one of the most famous confrontations in world history. In 490 BC, a Persian army landed in Greece. It seemed that the outcome of the war was already decided. Persia possessed enormous resources. Its army greatly outnumbered the forces of the Greek city-states. Yet something unexpected happened. On the plain of Marathon, the Athenians inflicted a crushing defeat upon the Persians. The victory at Marathon shocked the entire ancient world. For the first time, the mighty army of the Persian Empire had suffered such a serious defeat at the hands of a relatively small opponent. But this was only the first chapter of the struggle to come. Darius began preparing for another invasion. However, he did not live long enough to complete his plans. After his death, power passed to his son, King Xerxes. The new ruler was determined to finish what his father had started. He began preparing for a massive campaign against Greece. According to ancient historians, the preparations lasted for several years. Troops were gathered from across the empire. Ships were built. Food supplies were stockpiled. Bridges were constructed across rivers. Never before had Greece faced such a threat. When news of the scale of these preparations reached the Greek cities, many were gripped by fear. Some city-states chose to recognize Persian authority. Others searched for ways to resist. The situation was made even more difficult by the fact that the Greeks rarely acted together. They constantly competed with one another. Conflicts and wars frequently erupted between the cities. Each polis was primarily concerned with its own interests. Yet the danger was so great that several Greek states decided to unite. In 481 BC, representatives from various cities gathered to discuss a common defense. Thus, an alliance was formed with the goal of resisting the Persian invasion. Two states played the most important role within this alliance: Athens and Sparta. Athens possessed a powerful navy. Sparta commanded the finest land army in Greece. Despite their differences and long-standing rivalry, both powers understood that they could not stand against Persia alone. They had no choice but to cooperate. For the Greeks, this was not an easy decision. The Spartans traditionally viewed other states with suspicion. They rarely involved themselves in affairs beyond the Peloponnese. But now the situation demanded decisive action. When Xerxes' army began its march westward, the scale of the campaign astonished contemporaries. Ancient authors recorded incredible figures, speaking of hundreds of thousands or even millions of warriors. Modern historians consider such estimates greatly exaggerated. Nevertheless, there is no doubt that Xerxes' army was one of the largest military forces of its time. Its ranks included representatives from many different peoples of the empire. Persians, Medes, Egyptians, Phoenicians, Babylonians, and many others. Each people brought its own traditions, weapons, and military experience to the army. As this enormous force advanced toward Greece, many city-states began to doubt that victory was even possible. Some chose submission without a fight. Others prepared for defense. A crucial question stood before the Greek leaders. Where should they stop the enemy? After lengthy discussions, they decided to take advantage of the terrain. In northern Greece, there was a narrow pass between the sea and the mountains. This place was called Thermopylae, meaning the hot gates. In some areas, the pass was so narrow that the massive Persian army could not fully exploit its numerical superiority. The Greeks decided that this was where they would make their stand. To command the land forces, the Spartan king Leonidas was chosen. He came from an ancient royal line and was highly respected among the warriors. Leonidas understood that the coming battle might become one of the most important events in Greek history. If the Persians broke through Thermopylae, the road into central Greece would lie open before them. Very little time remained for preparation. The Spartans began gathering their troops. Allied cities dispatched their contingents. Across Greece, people understood that the moment approaching would determine the fate of their world. Ahead lay a battle that would forever enter the history of humanity. A battle in which a few thousand Greeks, led by a Spartan king, would attempt to stop one of the greatest armies of the ancient world. We will discuss in detail how the defense of Thermopylae unfolded, why the sacrifice of the 300 Spartans became a legend, and what impact this battle had on the future of Greece in our next video. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment below and let me know what topics you would like to see in future videos. I'd also love to hear your feedback on my narration. How do you find my storytelling style? And what do you think could be improved? Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.